shows up to countless events and documents them, so we'll have photographs forever of these events. And Karen Rice, a parishioner and co-editor of the 275th history book, who could not be with us today, but we're delighted to have her support in all that we've done with this. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Christopher to get us started and tell us a little bit about what Greenwich was like when Christ Church first began.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and congratulations on both the anniversary and the amazing book that you have put together. I encourage all of you to read it. Not only great history, but also extremely entertaining. So thank you for having me. So the earliest days, obviously, in Greenwich, the native population was the Huichquesquec. They were a Munsee, Algonquian-speaking Lenape people. And it's estimated that around 1600, their population, including the Hudson Valley and southwestern Connecticut, was about 9,000 people. Their first interactions with the Dutch were in 1609. In Greenwich, there are a number of villages, including at Greenwich Point, and another one near today's Diamond Hill. And these villages consisted of longhouses where multiple families would reside, and there were planting grounds near the longhouses. The area of today's state of Connecticut was first explored by the Dutch from New Amsterdam, who laid claim to it prior to 1620. And the first Dutch settlement was in Hartford in 1633. And of course, at the same time, the English were settling, and that sometimes caused some conflicts here. Daniel Patrick, Robert Feeks, and Elizabeth Feeks made the first settlement in the town of Greenwich on July 18, 1640. Today we celebrate that as Founders Day, and with them were at least 8 other Dutch and English settlers. Very difficult to imagine today, but at that time, Greenwich was really a rough, untamed wilderness. There was a constant threat of violence from the native population. It was a dangerous frontier located between a contested area between the English and Dutch control. And in an emergency, help was days, if not weeks away. In April of 1642, the Greenwich bore allegiance to the Dutch authority in exchange for recognition as a manor and protection from the native population. But by 1650, the control had reverted to the English in the New Haven colony. Greenwich was a part of Stamford until it was declared an independent town by act of the Connecticut legislature in 1665. So one way to look at the history of Greenwich is in kind of 2 periods. The earlier period where it was primarily an agricultural farming economy, and the later period that's more familiar to us today where it became a residential suburb, basically. And roughly, you can look at the dividing line between those 2 periods as the middle of the 19th century when the railroad came to Greenwich. That was in 1848. And the trend away from a primarily agricultural economy occurred really in earnest after the Civil War. So as a farming economy, the farmers would send poultry and produce, including potatoes, by packet boat to New York City. And at the time, because the Greenwich Harbor was very shallow, most of that maritime trade would occur out of Myannis Landing. During this period, the wealthiest members of the society would have been those who were involved in this transport of local goods. It's also interesting to think of today, at this time, Greenwich Avenue was basically nothing more than a dirt cow path. The primary commercial area was on the Putnam Road, near where Sherwood Place is today. At that time, it was called Mechanic Street. And Greenwich Avenue was originally known as the road to Piping Point. Piping Point is roughly where Roger Sherman Baldwin Park is today. And the farmers would use this narrow, dusty, muddy cow path to get their produce to a sloop landing at the end of Arch Street. So it was very rural in character, with farms and residences located at wide intervals, and the transition to a commercial center didn't really occur until the middle of the 19th century. Interestingly, one of the early proponents of Greenwich was William Boss Tweed, kind of a notorious figure, but he he fell in love with Greenwich. He came here in the 1860s, I believe, the first time. He founded what was called the Americas Club, which eventually, in 1872, I believe, they built this beautiful structure kind of across from where Indian Harbor Yacht Club is now. And he recognized that particularly the shore was going to become a very, very important location for wealthy New Yorkers to establish their estates. And he organized the Greenwich and Rye Steamboat Company in 1866, and 200 to 300 passengers would come at a time on the steamboat, and they would come. Many of them would fall in love with Greenwich. They would first become seasonal residents, and then later on they would become permanent residents. So he, like I said, and then in 1883, Tweed had predicted the development of the shoreline as residential communities. In 1883, the Belhaven Land Company laid out the first residential park in Greenwich, and Field Point Park would follow. And really, as demand for land increased, the transition away from the primarily agricultural economy accelerated because the land was simply too valuable. Many local farmers sold their property so that it could be subdivided for residential use. And of course, as more wealthy families relocated to Greenwich, first as seasonal residents and then as permanent residents, we see the development of many country and yacht clubs so that they could have social activities. And I believe I may be at the end of my allotted 5 minutes, so I'm going to pass it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was fascinating. We now turn over to Lynn Gorelick, who's responsible for the timeline at Christ Church and putting all that information and the dates and facts together. And I know how many of you have enjoyed that over the years. So Lynn, it's all yours.
Okay. 5 minutes. For 275 years, that's a challenge. At any rate, first of all, I think you've all heard of the Tomes-Higgins house. And Mr. Tomes built that in 1863. He was a member of the parish. Mr. Higgins bought it from him in 1977. And I would like to introduce and welcome Lee Grant. Lee, will you stand? She is the great-great-granddaughter of Mr. Foster, A. Foster Higgins. And by the way, they are buried in the cemetery, okay? And I'll get back to that in a minute. So, we Anglicans or Episcopalians were not terribly welcome in Greenwich at the start. The state was the Congregational Church was the church state. And so in the English sent missionaries from England, the SPG, the Missionary Society, and Mr. Mearson, Reverend Mearson from the Rye Church first visited and conducted Anglican services in 1705-6 in the homes. And with him was Colonel Heathcote. He's on the timeline. And he had to stand guard outside because they were attacked. They were not welcome here. So that lasted throughout the early 1700s, and then finally through the largesse of another gentleman from Rye Church, the Rye Anglican Church, Mr. Talbot. He gave us money, and Mr. Knapp, Israel Knapp, gave us the land. Mr. Talbot gave us the funds to build the first church, 1749, the Horseneck Chapel. And it's interesting that Horseneck Chapel was located pretty much right behind me in the parking lot here. That would be the first church. That blew down in a gale in 1821. The next church was built in 1832, and it was consecrated 1834. So we dealt with that. And then finally we outgrew that, and the third church was built in 1856. That's about where the annex is now, and that was a big stone church. That and the second Congregational Church were built at the same time. Their steeple was higher than ours. At any rate, we survived and we continued to grow. Then we outgrew that church, and finally the 1910 church was built, and the parish house and the Then the rectory was built in 1911. So 4 churches, and we're now worshiping in the 4th church. Now, big history here. We've had 10 rectors. That is quite amazing for 275 years of history. And Merrick is our 10th rector. Our first rector was Reverend Yarrington. He was hired in 1840 at $350 a year. And times have changed. And when I did the history line and did all this research, I always found it interesting. I like years and I like money. So I put how much they were all paid. At any rate, so Yarrington served from 1840 to 1895. When Merrick first heard that on my cemetery tour a couple years ago, he said, "What? How long was he here?" You know. Then he was rector emeritus for 3 years until 1898. And then the next rector was Thompson, the next one was Budlong, the next one was Wilson, the next one was Appleyard. I call him Saint Appleyard. Many of you remember him. He was a very beloved rector. Appleyard Hastings, Bishop, and then Jim Lemler, and then finally Merrick is with us. So 10 rectors in all that time. Now, I'm going to end by inviting you all to my cemetery tour on October 27th, 4 o'clock. And this year, some of the people that I've talked about are going to visit us on my cemetery tour. So please, please come, okay?
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was terrific. And now Emily Ragsdale is going to share with us, especially about women in the Episcopal Church and here at Christ Church. And one of the stars of our congregation is the Reverend Fleming Rutledge, who was one of the first women ordained in the Episcopal Church. So, Emily, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank Bobby for asking me to do this. It was endlessly fascinating and fun. The women of Christ Church have always been creative, dedicated, and very effective. We are not a group of Indians here. Women are rarely mentioned in the records of the church before the 20th century, but from the very beginning, they've donated everything from altar hangings to church silver to windows for houses for clergy. 152 years ago, in 1872, Vestry Minutes recorded that the Ladies Sewing Society donated $200 to re-roof the rectory and $500 to reupholster the pews. 3 years later, they raised money to repair and paint the rectory, and in 1876, they paid to replace the flagstone in front of the church, which was the 3rd church. In 1919, 13 women were voted into membership of the church, which was something because previously only the men were listed as members. In the 1920s, Deaconess Rachel Hemphill, in her annual report, thanked parishioners for the loan of their motor cars, which helped her make over 850 calls on parishioners that year. As Joanne said, she was an assistant rector and a curate all at the same time. In 1953, Mrs. William Oersch was the first woman elected to the vestry and served 6 years. And it appears in the records I read that one woman a year was sort of appointed to the vestry for a long time. And now half of our vestry are women, I'm happy to say. In the early 1970s, parishioner Fleming Rutledge felt called to the ministry and discussed it with Rector Brad Hastings, who supported her 100%, although Bishop Hutchins of Connecticut did not believe in the ordination of women. However, following the 1976 General Episcopal Convention, which voted positively to approve women as priests and bishops, Fleming was ordained and in 1977 became one of the very first women priests of the Episcopal Church in America. In 1981, Lydia Stevens became the first female warden of Christ Church. During her tenure, she and Mason Barrett were responsible for building the memorial garden, and Lydia donated that wonderful contemporary resurrection cross in memory of her husband, George, who'd also been a warden, and they are the only couple in the history of the church who've ever both been wardens. 8 female wardens have served since Lydia. In 1982, which I found this fascinating, the Episcopal Church women sponsored a forum on abortion with church women representing both pro-choice and pro-life positions. The intent was to present alternatives on a very personal issue that touched each of the individuals. Women have spearheaded much of the outreach at Christ Church, no surprise. In 1975, a small group of women, including Mary Catan, where are you, Mary? Raise your hand. Started Neighbor to Neighbor in the basement of the parish house to distribute linens, clothing, towels, and other supplies to clients of the social services department. Food was added in 1984. After 36 years in the same underground basement, Pam Kelly proposed a new space for Neighbor to Neighbor. And finally, after several delays, Pam as building chair and Karen Royce as development director cut the ribbon on August 31st, 2022 to open the new Neighbor to Neighbor building, which is behind the Thomas Higgins house. In the 1980s, Connie Cowan, Mimi Pivorato, and Muriel Brownlee, and Connie's right over there, began the 40-year tradition of cooking meals for the homeless shelter of the residents of Inspirica in Stamford. Last year, 39 women at Christ Church fixed meals for them. In 1991, due to the initiative of Penny Winters and Mary Jane Marks, the Christ Church bookstore opened in a former broom closet and has become a treasured resource for the community ever since. Thanks to the efforts of Karen Royce and Cheryl Kyle, the Indefudo School in the Diocese of Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa opened in 2008. Since then, 424 students have graduated from 7th grade. 204 of those have gone to secondary school. 17 of those have gone to college, and 1 will go to medical school this year. Karen and Cheryl each received an honorary Doctor of Humanities degree from Yale Divinity School. These are only highlights, as Christ Church women continuously serve the church as altar guild members, lay readers, Eucharistic ministers, and in many other less visible but no less valuable roles. Thank you.
Emily, that was great. Thank you so much. It just makes you want to go home and read the book right now. There's so much wealth of history and knowledge. Thank you.
There's something about women on the table.
Oh, great. Terrific. We'll look for the handouts on the table. And Joanne Book Night, no one takes more pictures of Christ Church to preserve its legacy than you. And so thank you for all that you do, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Merrick. And thank you, Bobby, for persisting, I think you'd say, in this book. It wouldn't be here without for Bobby. So early last fall, Lynn gave me a bag, not that big a bag, but pretty big, of photos and documents that she culled from the archive room. And I scanned them for use in the book. And then I photographed photos and objects in the Rector's Gallery, including in the wood case. And there are 2 yearbooks there, 1908 yearbook and 1912. This is another copy. It's in plastic as the cover's coming off. But this is the 1912 yearbook. And these basically were annual reports. And these books were, Reverend Thompson got these yearbooks going, and they went until 1931, so 1896 to 1931. This is 1929. So when Reverend Budlong came, they got bigger and thicker because he liked to write, and very opinionated. He became a bishop of Connecticut. And then Reverend Wilson, it was the Depression, and he was also very good at trimming committees, staff, budgets. He cut the book, which is sad because I love these things. So I've scanned them all, every page. It wasn't for the book. It was partly for the book, but also I'm thinking that we really need a digital archive of our materials, because, you know, the cover's falling off. Things can't be handled by everybody. So I'm also, I'm digitizing some old parish news and like capital campaign brochures. Here's one from 1950s, and it's very interesting inside. And we have like 5 copies of this, so I felt comfortable taking it out of the archives room. Yeah, Lynn finally let me go in there and borrow things. So I'd love to make things available. I know I'm going to be giving some pages to the Altar Guild because they have an anniversary coming up. So it's important, and I'm begging, if anybody has anything at home they think we might want, any yearbooks, the 1910 building plans, which would be super awesome because we somehow don't have ours anymore. Pre-digital, please. Just and slides. One of the things that that impressed me about this is that Christchurch history is really monochromatic up until like the 1970s. There's nothing in color. We have colorized postcards, thank you, Greenwich Historical Society, but we don't have color photos. So I found like 6 slides from the 1960s or the 1950s, and I found out the choir robes were blue. I didn't know that. Yeah, a lot of you probably knew that, but I did not know that. And I did not know that this floor was a beautiful forest green in here, linoleum. And also, there's a photo of somebody having a meeting with lots of partitions around, and he's smoking a cigarette. Thanks? No thanks. And Jane asked a great question. What have we learned about, Jane Snowden, sorry. What have we learned about Christchurch in doing this research? One thing I didn't know was all the incidentals, which are, I love stuff like how many times they repointed the masonry. I'm serious, I really like that stuff. Boilers, I love reading about all that. One thing I didn't know was the bell tower. I mean, maybe people know this. I'm probably going over my time, sorry. But the bell tower was built not according to William Dominick's design. He had pinnacles on his design. You can see that in the book. It was built with crenellations. 2 or 3 years later, when the Converse family gave more bells to the church, we rebuilt the tower, and that's when the pinnacles went up. And you can see those in the book also, and in old postcards. And I have a photo over on the stage you can look at later, and it shows the pinnacles. That's in a 1916 yearbook, I think. So in 1950, bam, there are no pinnacles, it's crenellations. So what happened? I thought maybe it was a hurricane. In 1945, aerial photo that I saw on the Greenwich Historical Society digital archives, which are great, by the way. There's Christchurch, 1945, with pinnacles. So I went and looked at the vestry minutes, which Lynn's read them all, but sometimes I can't read the handwriting. In 1949, they were taken down because the terracotta was falling, thankfully not outwards on people, but inwards. So they removed them and put up limestone crenellations the way they are today. I know that's very trivial, but I thought it was very interesting. I was going to talk about Tomes Higgins, but it's all in the panel here, and it's in the book. But I'm so happy that we did not sell to the Greenwich Library in 1979 or to a condo developer the next year. And also that Pat Beatty had this brilliant idea to have a showcase, and that Fifi Sheridan managed it so beautifully. I read all that for this, which is great. A lot of it's on the history panels and in the book. And one tiny thing about kids, can I do that, Bobby? One more thing. Okay. Kids have always been a huge part of Christchurch. I mean, you can read all the way back in the yearbooks. Sunday school was hugely important, and Bud Long said the care of children is one of our supreme responsibilities. And we had a church pageant way back when, like late 19th century, early 20th century. Now, some people think it started in the 80s, but there was a woman named Leonore Williamson, whom some of you know, I'm sure, who did the pageant from 1949 to 1989, 40 years. And Emily says she ran a tight ship, I think she said. But can you imagine? And she's the one, I think, who did the star, the angel with the star, but of course we know Sharon Lemler did our camel. But my time has run out, so that's all.
This is great. Wow. What memories. So if you all would be willing to take a few questions, if any of you have a question, especially if you can make a succinct one. Yes, Bob?
Church itself is freestanding, then we have the ancillary buildings that go towards Stone City. When did they erupt, arrive, get built, et cetera, and for what purpose?
So when did the parish house and the annex get built?
That one I
And
can
why were they
answer.
created?
That was all with the 1910 church. They first tried to raise all the money. Mrs. Witherall actually told the parish, I'll give you $35,000 if you will meet it, and we can build all 3 buildings. Well, the parish didn't do it, and she withdrew her money. And then Mr. Dominic Sr., who was the warden, got a little peeved with the parish, and he said, I'm doing it again. He said, I'm going to contribute $35,000 to build all 3 of those buildings, the church, the parish house, and the rectory. And he said, I give you until January something 1910. This time they paid attention, and they contributed all the money. But in the meantime, they started the 1910 church with what they had raised, and then once within that year, when they raised the rest of the money, they built the parish house and now the annex. The parish house is dedicated to Mr. Dominic's parents, who were members in the mid-1800s.
And the purpose of each of the buildings was?
Yeah, the church is the church, right? The parish house was where they had their meetings like this. And then the annex was the rectory where Reverend Thompson lived. And then Wilson lived there, and then they needed the room for Sunday school and offices, so we moved him to an apartment in Greenwich in the 1934, I think it was.
I can't believe you remember all of their names in order and where they lived. Yes, Ann?
Mention was made of that our church at some point in history had a lower steeple than Second Congregational, and I am very curious as to why design was never included for a steeple for Christ Church.
It's never too late, by the way, Ann.
We have to consult William Dominic, the architect. He was the nephew of the warden, Mr. Dominic, and he designed it, and in the church you'll see the original drawing that William Dominic did. And that drawing, by the way, is in the rector's gallery. You can actually put your nose up to it and see it. It's a beautiful drawing. But he designed it, and he did it without a steeple. Go figure. And I think where he was going, just design-wise, I think it's more English in its look than Second Congo. That's a rough guess, though.
Someone said that the Second Congo steeples, at the point when it was built, was the highest point between Baltimore and Boston.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Isn't that
right.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. You can see that from the coast. Other questions? Yes.
So my name's Jennifer. Anyway, I just wondered, is the archive open to only parishioners, or would it be open to the public that may be interested?
I seem to be dominating this, but you're going to all laugh at me, but I guard those archives with my life. She's the only one that I've let in there, Joanne. It took me 3 years to gather all of the materials, edit them, organize them, and they are in the little office off of the library in the parish house. So you're welcome, any of you are welcome to visit them, but you're going to visit with me and we'll make an appointment. Okay, and then I'll explain it to you. I'm an archivist as well. Oh, okay, well, give me a call and I'd be glad to take you and show you.
Rumor is that we possess the Holy Grail, but you have to go through Lynn to get a look at it. Yes.
Lynn, would that general rule of guarding apply to the digitalized copies of some of the directions of the church that Joanne has made?
First of all, they're not online yet, but we'd have to discuss it. I think it would need to be password protected, and you go through the church. It wouldn't just be like the Library of Congress, which is an awesome resource, but
Other questions? Any others? Yes, Terry.
I'm sure some of you, I call long timers, not old timers. We don't use the word aging in our house or old. But anyway, I knew all these rectors to some degree, and I'm sure some of you know this story. But Bob Appleyard was a lovely, absolutely lovely man. That's when this building was all added, and St. Barnabas and chapel and all that. Those are high times for people going to church, and he was a wonderful guy. But anyway, the story is that all three of his sons became Episcopal priests. And they said that one time, one of them was the innkeeper in the pageant. And so whoever was playing Joseph was knocking on the door and says, please, kind sir, can we spend the night? And this son of the rector said, you can't spend the night, but come on in, we'll give you a drink.
Spoken like a true Episcopalian. Any other final questions? Well, thank you, panel. You did a great job. We learned so much. And if it perked your interest, do go ahead and purchase a copy of this today at the bookstore. And have a blessed week wherever you go and whatever you do. God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you, panel.